You're listening to Secrets for Scaling, a Gecko Board podcast that explores the growth secrets of successful founders and CEOs. For this episode, we spoke with Peter Reinhardt, co-founder and CEO of Segment, a SaaS company helping thousands of businesses collect and leverage their customer data. Hey, Peter. Thank you for joining Secrets for Scaling.
Yeah, my pleasure. Great to be here.
To kick things off, for those who aren't familiar, can you tell us a bit about what Segment is, who your customers are, and what your business model is?
So Segment started as a way to enable analytics tools on your website with the flick of a switch. So the idea was that rather than going and instrumenting each of these different analytics tools, APIs and JavaScript snippets or iOS SDKs or whatever, that you could just implement one simple SDK. And then you could push a button to start sending that data to not just your analytics tool, but your email tool, your push notification tool, your attribution tool, help desk, your CRM. And what we discovered is that not only did this solve a really big problem for engineering teams in terms of implementing these things, but actually every team in a company depends on the customer data that the engineering team is recording. And so we help engineering teams collect all that data, unify it in one place, and then route that data to wherever the company needs it. So we're a software as a service company. Obviously, we have about 4,000 customers today. About 130 people, and we've grown from about 4 people about 3.5 years ago.
How's the Segment team structured today? What approach do you take to collaboration hierarchy?
Yeah, I think we're pretty traditional actually for a B2B SaaS company. I personally have 4 people who report to me. There's Zhenya, who leads go-to-market, Tito, who leads engineering, Chris, who leads product, and Adrana, who leads people and recruiting. So it's sort of like a business side of the house and then an engineering and product side of the house. I think in terms of collaboration and hierarchy, I think for a long time we were pretty Wild West around how we set goals. So sort of like everyone sort of knew what the vision was and where we were going. Especially when we were smaller, everyone would just sort of like run off in different directions and start getting stuff done. I think now as the team has grown and as we've matured a little bit as a company, we have gotten quite a bit better, I think, at goal setting. So I guess I'd say in terms of like how our teams are structured and how we think about organizing ourselves, we're trying to be very focused on what goals are we trying to accomplish and then really orienting ourselves around those goals. There's actually a really good story about this from SpaceX. Apparently there was this guy who was just getting a tour of SpaceX and he saw SpaceX engineer standing in a particular part of the sort of shop floor. And he's going by and he asked him, okay, well, what do you do for SpaceX? And the guy said, well, our mission is to go to Mars. And in order to go to Mars, we need to make rockets 10 times cheaper. And in order to make rockets 10 times cheaper, we need to be able to land the first stage back on Earth. I make the gimbal systems on the engines that help the first stage land on Earth, and you'll know if I'm successful. You'll know I'm successful if we land the first stage back on the drone ship in the Pacific Ocean on April 10th. And like that concept of like mission to metrics, I think is like a very powerful way of structuring and organizing a team where everyone understands the sort of breakdown from the final mission, which for SpaceX is to go to Mars, down to the thing that they're actually contributing to, which is like the design of gimbals on a rocket engine. And so we try to live up to that sort of ideal of goal setting and organization.
So at what point did you realize that you needed more structure around goal setting?
I think I was actually really slow on this. I think at some point, maybe it was like 1.5 years ago or so, our HR advisor and our part-time CFO called a meeting and they sat me down and said, Peter, you need to set goals. And I think I was still operating in the mentality of like a 20 or 30 person company where everyone sort of understands the goals and there's a couple people who are doing all the sales and there's a couple people who are doing all the marketing and it's sort of self-apparent what needs to get done. And we were transitioning out of that stage into like a 50 to 60 person company where we needed to have more clarity around like what the goals really were specifically because people needed context on what was important. So yeah, I'd say it was right around that size, like 50, 60. And really the sort of like direction to me came through very helpful feedback from our HR advisor and part-time CFO.
Based on your experience, do you have any tips for setting goals at that 50, 60 mark?
I think the biggest learning for us even earlier was just like the importance of writing things down as managers. When you're an individual contributor, it's easy. You have sort of like concrete deliverables, like you need to close this deal or you need to like build this feature or you need to produce this piece of content or answer this ticket or whatever. And obviously early on, the founders are doing those sort of concrete tasks as well. As managers, it's easy for things like goal setting or decisions or decision processes or these things to become sort of ingrained culturally or sort of tribal knowledge, but not actually be written down. And so I think part of actually making goals effective and the decisions that go into the goals effective is to write them down, which sounds trivial, but I really think that great managers write and then they're held accountable to the things that they've written rather than it being something that they told and they can change their mind next week and can say that they changed their mind, right? It's not written down anywhere. I think it's important that managers be able to be held accountable for the decisions that they make by writing them down.
So after you write them down, how do you share them with the team?
Usually we have sort of a drafting process where usually the person will draft what we call like a 20% draft, basically a rough draft, and then they'll circulate that for sort of initial structural feedback, like, well, I think this is just like the wrong idea, or I think this needs to be totally like flipped on its head or whatever. And that way no one is like too invested in like the wording in this phrase or whatever. That's still like having a pretty high level discussion. And then once there's broad agreement on sort of the structure of things, then we usually push for like a 90% draft where the person will really like make it very well written, very clear, and then that'll get circulated again. And then if we're going to publish it externally, then we'll go through a couple more revs to get it to like 95 or 100%. But for internal docs, it's usually just like 2080, 2090, sort of two steps, one piece of structural and one more fine-grained feedback in order to get it ready, and it gets circulated both times to the team.
So does everyone or every team come up with their own goals that they're sharing?
So for goal setting specifically, we do a annual goal setting process. I draft it. The exec team gives feedback on sort of a 20%. Then we get to like an 80% that I draft, and then the 80% then goes down to the team leads, sort of like the lieutenants who report into the exec team. They'll have a little bit more feedback, fine-grained feedback, but then they really have, by that point, they have a pretty clear picture of like what segment needs to get done in 2017. And then they work with their exec team member to start breaking down those goals into like, okay, well, what do we need to get done in Q1? What do we need to get done in Q2? What are the actual projects that we need to execute on? And I'm much less involved at that level, with the exception of product. I'm
curious to know, at what point did you bring on managers to manage that process beyond product?
There's a really good article on SaaStr, actually, SaaStr on Quora. He talks about the like most difficult scaling periods for founders. I think the toughest scaling period for founders is usually from like 1 million in revenue to 10 million in revenue. And the reason, I'm just quoting him here, the reason is like 0 to 1 is hard because it's product market fit. But from 1 to 10, you're actually running like a real business, right? Like you have a real set of customers. They have real expectations. Like you shouldn't go down. Support should be great, etc. So you have like real expectations from customers, but often you don't actually have the ability yet to hire great managers because you haven't sort of shown escape velocity, sort of like world-class talent that you want to lead each of your teams as department head or as a member of the exec team is not yet hireable, really. And then around 10 million in revenue, companies seem to be able to really start hiring and building an exec team. So that was sort of the phase where we finally felt like we could, like the revenue and growth sort of supported hiring like really world-class directors and execs. And then by that point, we were getting close to like 80 people or so. And we really needed it. Like we really needed experienced managers who could help set goals, who could help people think about their careers, who could do hiring, who were like excellent hiring managers.
So beyond the goal setting, is there anything else you do to keep the company aligned around the same mission, same vision?
So in the theme of great managers write, our vision is explicitly written. It's a doc that people can read in their first day. It's easily accessible if you go into the browser as a member of the Segment team and you type in SG space vision. It takes you straight to the vision doc, which outlines like where we're going over the next 10 years. I guess the fact that it's written and then we try to talk about it regularly. So whether that's like once or twice a quarter at all hands, trying to talk about how what we're doing this quarter is actually contributing towards getting to that vision. I think there's room for improvement in how frequently we talk about it, to be honest, but we do try to talk about it fairly regularly.
Switching gears a bit, how would you describe Segment's culture?
So we have 4 values that I think we actually live up to or live up closely enough that they can still be aspirational, but actually really represent, I think, what we're all about. A lot of people on their first day or first month comment on like, there's a lot of companies that sort of have values on the wall, but values that we've written down, actually, they're surprised, actually really are the values that people seem to live by. And those things are, we have 4 of them. The first is karma. And karma is basically that we want to have a positive impact on the world, which is not just through sort of like traditional philanthropy. I mean, we do donate a good amount, but also through like doing the right thing for our customers. So like not gouging customers, trying to be really helpful to our customers throughout the sales and marketing process. So not doing a lot of like aggressive sales tactics, but really focusing on how can we provide value at every step of the process by being helpful, writing great content, et cetera. And then also around data privacy. So we're very much about helping companies understand all their interactions with their users, but we're pretty against helping companies share data between companies. So we're not interested in helping Macy's share data with Walmart, but we are interested in helping Macy's understand all the interactions that they have with their customers. So we draw a pretty tight line for where we think the ethical line of where we think data privacy should sort of start and end. The second value is tribe, which is really about being super supportive of everyone at the company. And that's not to say being nice. In many cases, actually being really supportive means doing the hard thing and giving a peer or a manager or a direct report very direct, helpful, constructive feedback about something they could be doing better. So we have a pretty strong feedback culture, I think. The third piece is drive. And drive is really about finishing things. It's really easy to start a lot of projects. It's much harder to actually finish them. And I think when I was 12 or so, I was constantly taking on projects I was going to build a go-kart, and then I was going to build a supersonic weed whacker, and then I was going to build a rocket and whatever else. But I never really finished these things. I remember very clearly my dad sort of paused as I was excitedly telling him about a new project I was taking on. And he said, "You know what? Someday you're going to have to learn to finish things too." And for some reason that really stuck with me. And I think it's important that the value really, really gets delivered when something is finished. And so really pushing ourselves to finish things is something that we value. And the last and maybe most obvious one is focus. And focus is just about doing fewer things, actually finding the things that matter.
How have you scaled and maintained that culture with each growth spurt, with each round raise past the 30-person hump, the 50, the 100-person hump, and beyond?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure that I don't think there's a silver bullet there. I think you see meaningful transitions, culture, or certainly the social construct around 30 people when you start getting the first managers, and then around 80 to 100 when you start getting sort of a second tier of managers. And then I've heard, we're 130 people today. But I hear that as you transition through 150, you start to hit sort of a social construct limit around Dunbar's number. I'd say in the points that we've scaled through so far, I think the key is to basically just keep reminding, actually first just choose values that actually are representative of what you truly value. Not things that you think should be values, but things that you're willing to hire or fire someone for violating. That's real value. If for us, if someone just will never finish things, then they're not here, they shouldn't be at Segment. And I think if you truly believe in your values, then I think they're much more likely to survive and be maintained. I think oftentimes people don't really believe in the things, but they feel like they should. And I think those values tend not to survive. And then the second thing is, if you really believe in it, then it should be easy to sort of make it permeate a whole bunch of stuff. You can make it permeate performance reviews. You can make it permeate your hiring process of is this someone who displayed in their past jobs that they really would finish things? Is this person that we're looking at the performance of, are they finishing things, or are they sort of dropping things on the floor, et cetera? So you start to ingrain it in the processes, I think, and that's what causes it to live on forever, I think. But the social construct changes, of course. 130 people is a very different social situation than when it was 20. And I don't think you can fix that.
Have you formalized that process at all, or is it just something that's intrinsically known among the people who are doing the hiring and doing the performance reviews?
We try to formalize it. I'd say it's imperfect today, but we have culture interviews where we try to test for, in their past, did they live by these values, or are they sort of close enough that they would be willing to live by them? And certainly in performance reviews where we think about, is this engineer at sort of a level 2 or level 3? Well, are they able to finish things? What scope of things are they able to finish, right? We certainly apply our values in terms of comp leveling and performance management and so forth. And I think if that's what you value, then willing to put your money where your mouth is, as it were.
I'd love to hear a bit about how your role as CEO has changed as the company's grown, especially going from maker to manager and, manager of managers and beyond.
I started when it was just the 4 founders, I was basically the front-end engineer on the team. Once we hit product market fit in spring of 2013, I basically became the first salesperson, which I was absolutely terrible at. And so after raising a round of financing, we quickly hired Raf as our first salesperson, and he later grew to run sales for a while. And at that point, I shifted back towards sales engineering and support. So for a long time, I was splitting support with Jake and was really doing all the sales engineering, which I was actually quite good at least when paired with an excellent salesperson. And then at some point, it really shifted. We hired more salespeople, hired sales engineering, hired people who could double between support and sales engineering. And then I really shifted from that into more full-time management. I think that was maybe around 30 people or so. And I guess speaking candidly, it was a pretty tough learning curve for me to go from basically straight out of college. We dropped out in our junior year took us 2 years to sort of find product market fit. And then after finding product market fit, the time to becoming a pure manager was like a year, basically a year and a half. And so I think that was like a pretty challenging learning curve, especially since there's no manager above me, as it were, to sort of coach through that process. And then within another year, a year and a half, I was manager of managers. Now I think it's fairly continuous, like manager of managers is not that different from manager of managers. So I think like the learning curve for me, and I think for most CEOs going through this, is tough because you don't have a coach to bring you through it. And so I think the challenge is, how do you find a sequence of coaches that can help you through these different transitions? And so I've found that finding a whole series of coaches that can help for, say, 4 months and sort of push you up to the next level is very helpful, but you sort of constantly have to be finding and rotating in and finding a new coach. So for me, the first coach was a sales advisor, which sort of helped with my confidence in working with customers and like dealing with pricing and money and stuff like that I wasn't really comfortable with as an engineer. The second one was our part-time CFO, who really helped me understand sort of like the business at a more strategic level and start thinking through like how finance impacted the structure and how we were thinking about the company. And I've written a little bit about that on my blog. The third was actually a management coach, or an exec coach, who was really helpful in sort of changing my perspective of who I was. So the most useful thing that he did was a 360 review where all the people who were reporting to me filled out a survey and said, like, here's what you're doing well, here's what you're doing badly. And my perception was the reverse, what the reality was. And so that was helpful to correct that. And then the next advisor was an HR advisor who was incredibly helpful in like adding things like goal setting and so forth. And then most recently worked with a speaking coach who's helped me think about storytelling and speaking now to at all hands, which is 130 people, or at a conference keynote of 600 people or whatever. So I think the sequence of coaches is important, and recognizing which skill you need to double down on is important as well.
Yeah, definitely. That's great that you set specific goals for yourself and find the person to help you through that. Where do you find these coaches?
Usually they come through recommendations from other people in the network, and sometimes a coach will recommend a new coach. So like our HR advisor, who helped me a lot a year and a half ago, recommended the speaking coach who helped me for 4 months. And yeah, so I think it comes from the mixture of advisors, investors, and I guess other CEOs as well. Other CEOs are great sources because they may have needed help in a different area and got a recommendation from a different coach. So I think there's a social network of CEOs that I think are constantly making recommendations to each other about where to get help on different topics.
I think we touched on this a bit already, but what does it look like to set your team up for success now that you have grown beyond 130 people?
I think 3 things, which I think are all fairly aspirational, by the way. We definitely are not perfect at these. The first is setting super clear goals with accountability built in. Not just clear goals at a department level, but actually what are the company's goals, and then letting those be cross-functional efforts across the teams, I think was an important shift for us. So yeah, super clear goals, number 1. Number 2, actually having the right exec team in place is super important. Just having the right people on that team who actually can execute against the goals that you're setting. If you don't have that, you're dead in the water. And then the third is just always looking for ways to inject the values into the company, whether it's performance reviews or whatever. Like, what are the constant ways that you can be injecting those values and setting a strong cultural tone yourself? I think those are 3 things that basically the CEO can never delegate. And I think at 130 people, those are probably the 3 most important things that I think I do.
What's been your biggest personal challenge as a founder growing the business? And how have you worked to overcome that?
I've actually written a little bit about this from the perspective of product market fit, but I think there's an internal dishonesty that founders often have that's more broadly applicable than just product market fit. Basically, it's another way of looking at it is sort of like lying. Founders often lie to themselves about whether they have product market fit or not. And I think it comes from this mixture of sort of pitching constantly, whether it's hiring or investors or a customer, where you're like pitching, and sort of this like reality distortion field that's so valuable in pitching customers and investors and hires. It's critical there, but at the same time, if it invades your own head, the like intellectual dishonesty of what the real problems are and how bad those real problems are, that sort of being able to bridge those 2 things of seeing all the problems for real, but then being able to distort reality enough to continue hiring and bootstrapping along the way, I think is like a very fine line to walk. And I think it's very easy to fall down on that line. So yeah, I think there's a learning how to balance those 2 perspectives. 1, everything is broken. 2, reality distortion that everything is amazing. And in reality, it's somewhere in the middle, of course.
Yeah. And I mean, I feel like there could be an entire episode about that, right? But do you have any specific tips on how you've been able to walk on the right side of that line or find that balance right on it?
I think there's a normalizing effect that comes from having great co-founders. If you ever cross over into the too much reality distortion field, I think great co-founders will chop you off at the knees. But I think when you're down or you're facing like a tough set of problems, I think great co-founders will lift you back up again as well.
And would you say that you've balanced work and life as a founder?
Definitely not in the traditional sense. I'm personally pretty far from being burned out. Like I get a lot of energy from what I do every day. It's balanced enough for me, but I think most people would probably not call it balanced. I do take breaks throughout the year, so maybe like 5 to 6 weeks of vacation per year, traveling in the US or internationally with my wife, which is a lot of fun and I guess a privilege of the job. But during an actual work week, I'm typically working like 6 days a week, sometimes 7. And I think probably traditional work-life balance for a high-growth startup founder doesn't really make sense. I think you're either obsessed with it and like trying to deal with the growth or you're sort of not obsessed with it. And I guess my perspective would be if you're not obsessed with it, then why bother? There's lots of other easier jobs where you don't have to be obsessed with it. So I think it's a job for the people who want to be obsessed.
A great point. Now that Segment's over 5 years old, if you're going to give any piece of advice to founders who are just beginning to scale their business, what would it be?
I guess it would be to play to win the long game. We failed pretty hard for the first 1.5 years, and we've seen a lot of different rocket ships pass us by and then stall or fall to the side, sometimes spectacularly, like leaving craters. I think just patiently playing the long game and building a really great business and just sort of focusing on the things you can control, like keeping the locus of self-control of like, this is my business and I can keep building it and making it better every day. It's hard, but I really think it's the best thing. And I think it's hard to be patient on that when you see another company like blowing up overnight and doing super well. But like, I promise, just wait a year. You'll see they're going to have problems too. And then I guess the only other piece of advice would be like to take the breaks that you need and sort of like think for yourself, like get that perspective so that you're not caught up in that just like whirlwind of activity. I think that helps keep the patience to just keep building a business.
So with that, I think that's a great point to wrap up at. Thank you so much again for taking the time to speak to us today, Peter. Thank you for listening to Gecko Board's Secrets for Scaling podcast. If you know of someone who you think would be a great guest for Secrets for Scaling, or if you want to share your own scaling story, email me anytime at shannon@geckoboard.com. We'd love to have you. If you've been enjoying Secrets for Scaling, please consider giving us a review on iTunes. We'd appreciate it.